our second episode on the liturgical movement. Last time, we saw in the beginnings of the movement, it had a purpose, and it started out very well. Today, we'll look at some of the major figures of the interwar period in Europe, like Dom Ordo Calzelle in Germany, and what was different about their contributions compared to Dom Guéranger, who we saw last episode. Then we'll see how World War II, which affected history on every level, had also a major influence on the liturgy. How during the French occupation and after, that modernism started to sneak into the movement, and how it never really left the movement after that. For more on this entire topic, check out the Liturgical Movement at Angelus Press. Also on sspxpodcast.com/mass, you'll be able to find all of these episodes, videos, and resources. This is free to listen to, but please do consider a one-time or a small monthly recurring donation so we can continue this work. Now let's join Father Leo Anthony Janos for episode 13, How the World Wars Affected Liturgy. Father Janos, great to have you back, and we're going to pick up where we left off last week, right?
Yes, so last time we talked about the liturgical movement, kind of starting with Dom Guéranger and then moving up through basically the pontificate of St. Pius X. So now we're going to go from there and try to work our way all the way to Vatican II, and we'll see where it takes us. So this, just a little bit of a caveat, the material that I'm going to try to cover in this one podcast would typically probably take me about 6 hours of class time. Okay. So I'm going to both try to move fast. I've talked with Andrew. We'll try to see what we can do to add some little subtitles of the names of some of the names of the different actors that I'll be mentioning. Yeah, I'm just going to try to talk and just kind of give you the story as best I can.
That's good.
I will mention that at the beginning that we're not going to post any notes for this particular podcast. So I'm mostly referencing Father Bonterre's book by Liturgical Movement. Andrew has it in front of you there.
Oh, it's zooming. Sorry.
That's all right. So if anyone wants to learn more about this aspect of liturgy, I am pulling from some other sources, but for the most part, following that book. So,
okay, sounds good. So let's see how good your speed run is today, Father.
We will find out.
All right. So are we going to be kicking off with France, Belgium, same sort of place where Dom Guéranger was?
Right. So what I'm going to try to do is more or less, I'll try to break it up into kind of three different periods. So we'll talk about more or less between the wars. So we ended more or less with the pontificate of St. Pius X, which is at the beginning of World War I. Not a whole lot happened then. There'll be a little bit of overlap, but I'll be mostly picking up kind of between the wars. And then my second period I'll talk about is during World War II and the aftermath of World War II, so more or less the 1940s. And then kind of the 1950s and onward to the Second Vatican Council. So, and during that time, since most of the action, if you will, that's taking place that we're going to be looking at took place either in the French-speaking countries, so that's going to be France, Belgium, or in the German-speaking countries, Germany, Austria. Kind of during both of those, or all three of those periods, rather, I'll be looking at the first the French-speaking countries and the German-speaking countries. I'm basically trying to do my best to kind of paint a very complicated picture in fairly simple terms to kind of help you go through the history and give you a little bit of a historical aspect, because it's a big change. How did the liturgical movement, right? It started with Dom Guéranger, it started with St. Pius X, very good beginnings. How did it all of a sudden become the mechanism which modernism is going to use to infiltrate the church? Because that's exactly what happens. So anyway, long, complicated history. I'll do my best to synthesize it. We'll see how it goes.
You must go faster. Must go faster. I'm joking. Take your time.
Tell me if I'm going too fast, because that might be
okay.
That could be a danger.
If I start scratching my head, I'll let you know.
All right.
All right.
So I'm going to start with the time between the wars. In fact, it starts a little bit before even World War One, but where it really kind of starts kicking off is during World War One, and then the period between that and World War Two. And we'll start with the French-speaking countries, so France, Belgium. So towards the end of St. Pius X's reign, you remember we left off with Dom Guéranger reforming the Benedictine order in France. Towards the end of St. Pius X's reign, the Pope and the French state had a bit of a falling out. And that led eventually to the religious orders being exiled from France once again. And so the newly founded French Benedictine congregation moved to Belgium. It already had, so Dom Guéranger's House of Salem had already started some daughter houses, particularly in Meridsu, Belgium, and Montcésaire, Belgium. So, if you will, the epicenter of the liturgical movement kind of moves to Belgium as a result of those political upheavals at the time. So I'm going to start with arguably the most important character of the liturgical movement after Dom Guéranger, who's going to be Dom Lambert Baudouin. He lived from 1873 to 1960. So he was originally a diocesan priest, ordained 1897. And he, as a diocesan priest, he did a lot of work with the common laborers. So he wasn't technically a worker priest. Those came later on. They were kind of socialist. They came in the kind of 1940s. But if you will, he was something of a forerunner of that. In any case, he was intent on laboring with or working, evangelizing the common workmen and trying to improve their social conditions and stuff, something that didn't need to happen, realistically. There was definitely some problems among the industrial workers at the time. So that was one of his big focuses as a diocesan priest. Just 9 years after his ordination, he decided to become Benedictine. So he entered the Benedictine monastery of Montcésaire, which was, if you remember, one of the daughter houses of Salem. And there he, as a Benedictine, he comes in contact with an author who probably many have heard before. Dom Columba Marmion was his first prior. And through him, he comes into contact with Dom Guéranger's works. Dom Guéranger was deceased by this point, of course. But in any case, he comes in contact with his works. And when St. Pius X begins his liturgical reforms, Dom Baudouin receives them with a lot of enthusiasm. And he really kind of takes to heart what St. Pius X says about the importance of the liturgy, and he sees that as going to be a big source of apostolic labor with the faithful. And so he was apparently a very charismatic fellow, very active, very energetic. And he kind of really, in a certain way, becomes the new life force of the liturgical movement. And at first, this is more or less for the good. So he, if you will, his goals were perhaps somewhat similar to Dom Guéranger's. So they start off, trying to make the piety of the faithful more liturgical. So he's trying to encourage them to receive Holy Communion regularly, as Pius X recommended. He's also, perhaps his greatest work is to encourage priests to make retreats at liturgical centers, which will be Benedictine abbeys. So what he called liturgical retreats, and just trying to increase the love for the liturgy in the clergy and in the faithful. So like I said, at the start, he's continuing with Dom Guéranger's initiative, but in fact, his emphasis is a little different. And that is eventually what's going to completely twist the liturgical movement. So because he was a little bit of, a priest interested in workmen and kind of an activity, a lot of pastoral activity. He kind of holds as what's most important the teaching of the faithful, right? The instructional value of the liturgy, which is certainly there. But you remember for Dom Guéranger, we said and for St. Pius X, what was most important to liturgy was that it was first a prayer to God, and only secondarily a source of instruction for the faithful. So Dom Baudouin will end up basically inverting those two goals. So making what's primary, what's most important, the instruction for the faithful, the value that it brings to the faithful, the pastoral or apostolic work. And that is, even though it starts off in a very minor way, it's eventually going to completely taint the liturgical movement. So, in fact, in Father Bontier's book, he calls that the great temptation of the liturgical movement is to make the liturgy a means of apostolate first, and only afterwards a source of prayer.
And just to be super clear, this is not a bad thing in and of itself to make the liturgy, or for the liturgy to be an act of apostolate. It is, but secondarily below the primary reason, which is adoration of our Creator.
Correct. Right. So, and it certainly does have an instructional value during the Middle Ages and such. It was very much used as a source of instructing the faithful, especially if they were illiterate. Right. But yeah, so the problem though is precisely taking it and kind of inverting those ends, right? It seems very subtle, but it'll have drastic consequences. Sort of like, inverting the ends of marriage, right?
Right.
Making it first the mutual love and support of the spouses, and only secondarily for the children. That's just simple. That one simple little change can have a tremendous effect. I teach logic class at seminary too. One of the principles in logic is a small change in principles gives you a large change, a big change in the conclusions.
Exactly.
Okay. In any case, so moving on with Dom Baudouin. So he started these liturgical retreats, very well received, very popular among the clergy, and has some influence among the faithful also. Then comes World War I. So during that war, the Germans invade Belgium, and Dom Baudouin, because of his contacts with the industrial workers and such, and kind of his own, charismatic, active character, he gets involved with the resistance work in Belgium, so resisting the German invaders. And he actually became something of a resistance leader in Belgium at the time. He even had his own code name that the British would refer to whenever they're radioing back and forth. In any case, he was a great friend of Cardinal Mercier, who was a Belgian prelate at the time, and Cardinal Mercier was famous for having written this famous pastoral letter to the Belgian people, kind of in reaction to some unfortunate incidents with the German army, where some priests had been killed during one of the invasions of the city. He wrote this letter that was apparently mostly drafted by Dom Baudouin, basically encouraging the Belgian people to rise up and resist the invader. So due to all this, Dom Baudouin eventually had to flee Belgium, and he fled to England, where he spent the remainder of the war. And there he formed a number of ties with some Anglican clergymen, mostly due to his interest in the Oxford movement. So remember, he's interested in the liturgy. The Oxford movement is about liturgy from an Anglican perspective. So he forms these contacts with them, and that actually begins to have a very profound effect on Dom Baudouin. And he starts to be kind of obsessed with their reunion with the church, but not the reunion in the sense of a conversion and a return to the church. It becomes much more of a kind of an ecumenical idea, right? So, in any case, he returns to Belgium after the war, and there he met a Eastern primate and begins to become fascinated with the Eastern origins of monasticism and the Eastern liturgies and such. Not long after his return, so his abbot in Belgium, Montcésar, sees him as a bit, as he said, restless, very active. And so, but nonetheless, he respects him. So he doesn't really know what to do with him. So he sends him to Rome, where he becomes a professor at St. Anselm's College in Rome. So St. Anselm's College was a college connected to Benedictine Abbey of St. Anselm. And there, in this college, he begins to kind of influence his students with his own new sort of infatuation with the Eastern Church and with reunifying the church from all of the schismatics, right? Anglicans or the Orthodox. I'm just going to read this one little description, which the abbot of St. Anselm's at the time writes of Dom Baudouin, which I think is interesting. So he describes him as a monk of highly sanguine temperament, an extremely vivid imagination, a fire and a blaze for his own projects, almost contemptuous of the Western Church, a man with a powerful attraction to external activity. So definitely describes him as something of an activist. And you can see there's already a bit of a problem, contemptuous of the Western Church, fascinated with the East and his own projects, not things that go well with the sacerdotal character.
Right. So he's got his own little pet projects, his own little, things that he's really invested in.
Right.
Not necessarily a bad thing until it becomes all encompassing. And now he's teaching it to other students.
Right.
As well.
Right.
Yeah.
So his fascination with the East and the Anglicans and reunification of the church is not helped by, at the time, Pius XI's manifestation of his own great interest in reunifying the East. So at the time, so shortly after the Russian Revolution, you remember, and so the East is still very much unsettled because of the Communist Revolution. And Pius XI saw that as a possible opportunity for reunifying the Eastern Western churches. And so he starts to kind of, promote this dialogue with the East, with the Orthodox churches, to try to reunify them. And that's something that Dom Baudouin is all on board with and very much wants to help out. And he's kind of under the patronage of Cardinal Mercier at the time. And so, but since he knew the English better, he begins to kind of take over a bit or at least be very heavily involved with kind of a similar outreach to the Anglican Church. So during this time, what's called the Molin Conferences took place between 1921 and 1927. Dom Baudouin kind of assisted some of that because a major actor from the Catholic side in those conferences was Cardinal Mercier, so he was Cardinal Mercier's personal theologian. Anyway, he prepares some documents, talking about the Anglican Church, as he calls it, united but not absorbed in the Catholic Church. Anyway, a lot of ecumenical tendencies are already starting to appear. In 1925, Dom Baudouin was authorized by Pius XI to establish a new kind of monastery, what was called a monastery of union. So his idea was that basically you'd have Western Rite monks together with Eastern Rite Catholic monks, so the Uniate churches, not the Orthodox. Any case, and so this monastery would kind of unite the two. And his idea was basically, as he says, the monks would aim at forming in themselves an Oriental soul, rediscovering all the riches native to the Christian Orient, right? Anyway, so the study of the Orient, kind of the reconciliation between the Orthodox and the Anglicans is what this monastery is all about. In any case, and Dom Baudouin has all these kind of odd theories about the Catholic doctrine not being expressed properly. He doesn't say it's an error, but leaves something, it's insufficient, is kind of his wording, in expressing, and he wants to find better ways to explain it to the Anglicans, to the Orthodox, to help them, facilitate their return to the church. So this monastery, not surprisingly, ends up becoming very ecumenical. It starts publishing a review, which was very ecumenical, and eventually is noticed by church authorities. And Pope Pius XI begins to realize that he'd been a little bit too easygoing with the whole ecumenical question. And so he publishes a famous encyclical, Mortalium Animos, which is precisely dealing with ecumenism. And, dealing with ecumenism from a Catholic perspective, it's valuable. It gives kind of the Catholic approach to ecumenism. So he publishes that kind of as a reaction to all these things that are going on. Dom Baudouin sees that encyclical as a personal attack. And so he realizes his monastery isn't in the best standing with Rome. So he eventually resigns his office as prior. He's ordered to go to Rome to be investigated and for his ecumenical tendencies. And he is eventually ordered to have no contact with his monastery. So he more or less goes into exile, if you will, eventually arriving in the Diocese of Bourges, France. The archbishop at the time was quite liberal, and so he receives Dom Baudouin in exile, but allows him to kind of continue his apostolate of liturgical retreats. So
it's interesting. Sorry if I'm stepping over your father. Father McFarland a year or two ago at our chapel talked about if you lose your principal goal for something, it's going to end in disaster. And I think don't quote me. I think he was talking about Shackleton or one of these other Antarctic explorers, and he wanted to be maybe it was I don't know. He wanted to be the first to reach the South Pole, and these scientists and the government was like, "Well, you're going there anyway. Take all of the scientific equipment with you. Take all of this heavy stuff." And Father was explaining, that whole mission was lost. Most of them died, or all of them died. Again, don't quote me, but it was because they were trying to save the equipment and their cargo was too heavy. And if you're split on your goals, it's going to fail. And it seems like that was sort of the same thing here. He was so intent on ecumenism for the sake of ecumenism that he lost his primary goal, which is the salvation of souls or truth or, et cetera. Do I have that kind of right or no?
Similar, yeah. So he definitely had a love for the liturgy. That's obvious. But, and that is kind of the way the devil works, right? If there's a good initiative, the devil tries to start twisting it aside by adding in this little extra thing, like you say, kind of an extra goal. And little by little, that extra goal becomes more and more important until the initial goal is forgotten, right? Mm-hmm. That's the way the devil works. And
as I'm hearing you talk about this, it's really sad because it seems like he's got a lot of good intentions and just gets lost.
Yeah. So he's definitely, we'll talk about it a little bit too when we get to the 1950s, but he's definitely, another big problem with it is actually also activism. And that's one of the big major problems with how the liturgical movement kind of twists aside is there's a lot of activism that comes into play, a lot of youth groups that are being, it's all the youth priests, stuff like that, trying to influence the youth. It's a perfectly good initiative, but the problem is that it becomes, they lose the whole aspect of prayer. And that's Dom Chotard with his book, the famous book, The Soul of the Apostolate. He's writing it during this whole time. And that's precisely what he's talking about. All these priests going out with their youth groups and such. And, and that has, we'll see in the 1950s how it completely subverts the whole thing.
Yeah, I have my copy of that book at home. And I was hoping, I wanted to hold it up. And so I was looking behind me because as you're talking about this, it was exactly clicking. Right. He didn't read that book and it's so important.
Yeah. And that's why.
Sorry.
So you're fine. But he inverts the, Dom Guéranger was very, very clear on, and St. Pius X also, very clear on what's first in the liturgy is the worship of God. Only after that does it come to the instruction of the faithful. And for because of his past, his pastoral work, everything like that, he begins to be more and more obsessed by that, and so much so that it takes the wrong twist eventually of, I've got to save these souls who are the Anglicans, right? But ending up, departing from the initial Catholic principles to try to do that. And that's the whole ecumenical thing. Let's just forget all these things that divide us, focus on what unites us, and then, then we'll be united. But we won't be Catholic anymore, right?
Right.
In any case, all right. So I'm going to try to move on. We'll see how this goes.
Sure, no problem. This is great.
All right. So then I'm going to move over to Germany. So still the same time period, kind of between the wars, a little bit during World War I and between World War I and World War II. So there's the monastery of Maria Laach in Germany. So very brief. The Kulturkampf of Bismarck in the 1870s. And again, a lot of the monasteries were kind of dissolved. Germany had plenty of its own religious unrest. Monastery of Maria Laach was a very old monastery, but the monks were exiled several times. It was reestablished in 1892. And just a couple years later, 1894, a young man enters the monastery. He eventually became priest and later its abbot. His name is Dom Edelfons Erwegen. So he was the abbot of that monastery for a long time, starting in 1913. And one of his big efforts, he also is very interested in the liturgy. One of his big efforts is more after World War I. He wants to help post-war Germans kind of recover from the horrors of the war, right? Germany had been just destroyed by the World War I, and the resulting armistice didn't do any good either. So he wants to try to help Germany recover that by reinstilling a liturgical piety, right? He wants that to kind of help feed the people because the people need feeding at this time. The problem is, his idea of the liturgy was influenced by what is called archaeologism. So this kind of idea that we go back to the primitive church and the primitive practices in the liturgy. I think in the thing that we read from, the little excerpt we read from Dom Guéranger last time, Dom Guéranger mentions that kind of that idea, we're going to go back to the primitive church and such. In fact, he says it's really just kind of an excuse for basically changing what we have now. We're going to depart from what we have now and supposedly in order to go back to what's more primitive and therefore more pure, just like Luther did for, he said, we're going to get rid of all these Middle Age doctrine and go back to the purity of the scriptures, right? And in doing that, completely throws out the proper understanding of doctrine and the proper understanding of the scriptures. So influenced by this archaeologism, something that was condemned by Pius X in connection with modernism. But nonetheless, he has this idea, we want to go back to that. The Middle Ages kind of added too many extra things to the liturgy, overburdened the liturgy. We got to go back to its original purity. And he also said the Middle Ages have the kind of influenced the liturgy wrongly by making it more of a subjective piety, right? So it's more about my own personal prayer with God. And he said the liturgy should be like, the whole church together praying as a community. There's some truth in this, but he over-exaggerates it. Yeah. So he's really going to kind of go into that unhealthy archaeologism and kind of this corporate piety, right? This prayer of the church as a community, the emphasis on the community, etc. In any case, so he was particularly influential. So he doesn't really come into the Second Vatican Council too much as a lead up to it, except for in those who he influenced. So he's famous for influencing primarily Romano Guardini, who was Italian, but Italian priest, lived in Germany. And also very famously, one of the monks of Marialoch, so one of those under his tutelage, whose name was Dom Odo Calzelle. So Dom Calzelle is an interesting character because, in fact, he also had a great love for the liturgy. But I think if we could say he's probably the single most influential predecessor of the New Mass. So many of his theological ideas, when we get eventually to the podcast on theology, we'll actually be talking a lot, mostly of his theological ideas. Many of his theological ideas are what are going to be incarnated in the New Mass. Dom Calzelle probably would have been horrified if he'd seen the New Mass. Yeah. So he lived from 1886 to 1948, died well before the New Mass came out. But nonetheless, his theology is very much what influences it. We'll talk more about that later. I'll just mention a brief. So he's basically credited with the development of what's called the theology of mysteries. So it's kind of, it's not going to too much, but if you see Father Wiseman's, I think, old podcast on Immanuel Kant, the philosophy of Immanuel Kant and how that influences modernism. So basically, the modernists, they're all about, religious experience. And that's because it's influenced by the philosophy of Kant. Kant is an idealist. So for him, there's no connection between the mind and reality. There's no connection whatsoever. And so therefore, I can't know reality. I can't know the way things are. The only real connection I have with reality is what he calls sensible phenomena, right? So basically, my experience is the only contact I have with reality. I can't know reality. It's just by experiencing it that I learn what's real and what's not. So Dom Calzelle is going to kind of take that spirit and put it a little bit in the liturgy, right? So there you are. You have the episode there.
Yep, episode 3. We'll link it in the show notes.
Okay.
It's fascinating. This has changed. As a total side note, I'm sorry, Father, I'm distracting you. But this episode helped me understand so much better the modern way of thinking, the modern world. It looks super boring. I did an awful job with the title of this, but man, was it good.
Yeah.
So
no, I teach logic again, and there's so much just on this philosophical level, because if you can't say what is, my mind doesn't correspond with reality, I can't say what's true or false, right? And so how do I know what's true? There's no such thing as dogma. There's no such thing as doctrine, and therefore things can change, right? The evolution of dogma is a huge modernist idea, right? And so dogma changes. There's nothing that's stable. There's nothing that's firm, because the only way I can know reality is through my experiences, right? My experiences can change from one day to the next, from one culture to the next, right? So anyway, I do recommend watching that podcast if you want to learn more about that. In any case, so back to the question of the liturgy. So Dom Calzelle is going to kind of bring that into the liturgy with the idea of the mysteries. So for him, the mystery is it's a symbol of some reality that puts us in contact with God himself, right? It's by the mystery of the incarnation, celebrating the mystery of the incarnation in the liturgy, or the mystery of the redemption in the liturgy, that we're somehow actually put into contact with the historical event, right? So we're there at Calvary watching our Lord die once more every single Mass, like really historically present, right? It's by experiencing that's what puts me back in the presence of all that. In any case, so this is something which has a tremendous effect on the New Mass. I don't want to get into it much more, but we'll come back to that idea when we look at the theology behind the New Mass.
Okay.
So Dom Calzelle in spite of his great influence on the new Mass, he actually led a very quiet life himself. He was the chaplain for some nuns. That's pretty much all he did, besides being the editor for a German liturgical journal. And that's where his ideas began to be spread. And in fact, it's not Dom Calzelle that brings those ideas to the new Mass. It's one of his later admirers, Father Louis Bouillet, who we'll get to. He's the one. He's really the one who brings kind of those ideas, those theological principles, and reforms the Mass based on them.
Okay.
One other person we'll mention from Germany at this time is Father Pius Parsch. So he's actually from Austria. He's an Augustinian. Another activist, very interested in parish work. And he, so there's actually, he had some good works on the liturgy. Famously, I think it's called the Church's Year of Grace. It was actually a favorite of Archbishop Lefebvre. It's 4-volume work on just kind of going over the church's liturgical year. So he had some decent works, but he also had some really, really radical ideas, particularly in practice. So he came up with what he called the People's Mass. So essentially it was a Mass that was mostly in German. So he translated things in the vernacular. They simplified things. They had a new chant that was made up that was, he thought, simpler than Gregorian chant. They had offering of the gifts, where people would bring the gifts up and stuff like that, as though they were, coming back to the old times where they used to do things like that. Primitive liturgies. They had the kiss of peace, which was indicated by handshaking. All these things might sound a little familiar.
Right. Am I a modernist? People in the comments are going to say it regardless. I don't care. In saying any one of these little things, they have been done in the past, not necessarily wrong in and of themselves, but put them all together, start doing them, and you're going to start to have an emphasis that's totally different than what you've had.
So,
there's nothing wrong with shaking hands during the kiss of peace, but we also have to recognize that the church did away with that for a reason.
Right, exactly. And I think that's the main thing is that, so yes, some of these things were done, probably not shaking hands. I don't know if that was the, back then, but some of these things were done in the early liturgies. So like the offertory procession, bringing in that's what we have now. The kind of the modern day equivalent of that is the collection that's taken place during the offertory, right? But anyway, some of these different things happened, but the church over time, in her wisdom and her experience, realized that these things weren't healthy or weren't helpful. Or sometimes, like when the doctrines of real presence began to be under attack, the church realized, okay, we have to change some of the ceremonies a little bit to express more of our adoration of real presence, especially happens during the Council of Trent, right? The genuflections, the reverence, everything like that. And so some of these other practices, which started off okay, with perfectly good reasons, but since they maybe weren't that conducive to that belief in the real presence, that reverence, the church did away with them, and that was for a good reason, right? So, anyways, we'll come back to those ideas, I think, when we look at the new Mass. But anyways, so Pius Parsch started the People's Mass. He also writes some other things about the Mass. So, for example, this is one excerpt from his. Yes, what is the Mass? Above all, it is a meal, and a truly significant meal, since it is linked to eternal life, union with Christ, and the resurrection. He goes on to talk about its sacrificial aspect, but, kind of the damage is already done when you say, it's above all, it's a meal, right? And in keeping with that idea, he calls the altar a table instead of an altar, etc. So, anyways, even though there were some good things that he wrote, you have to be a little, discerning when it comes to some of his writings, because there definitely is some unhealthy elements that are present. All right, so we're going to move on to the next period. So we'll talk about kind of the period during World War II, excuse me, and and in the immediate aftermath of World War II, so more or less the 1940s. So this period is so kind of between the wars. You saw Dom Baudouin begin to get influenced by ecumenism. Germany, things started getting a little crazy, mostly due to archaeologism, some weird ideas that are coming in from the Eastern mysticism. In any case, the period between the wars, a little bit before World War II, I'm kind of overlapping some, but anyway, a little bit before World War II, but especially during World War II and the aftermath of World War II, modernism starts to make inroads on the liturgical movement. So just a little bit of kind of, let's say, some background on that. So after St. Pius X condemned modernism, then its proponents kind of moved underground. Either they were censored by the church or they went into hiding, more or less, or just kind of kept quiet. In fact, there was sort of an inquisition of sorts almost that was set up during Pius X's reign. Seems like he didn't really have that much. He didn't, really give his approval to this, but in any case, some cardinals kind of set up this sort of investigative office. It was called the Sodalitium Pianum, that would kind of investigate suspicions of modernism and stuff like that. Eventually, it was kind of closed down under, I think it was under Pius XI's reign. But anyway, it wasn't ever really sufficiently sanctioned by Rome. But so, in any case, St. Pius X's censures of modernism occurred primarily in the areas of dogma, of course, theology, right? Scripture studies, philosophy, church history, those sorts of things. And so the Pontifical Biblical Commission and the Holy Office exercised a lot of oversight in those areas. And that's where they really saw as being, dangerous ground for modernism to make influence in the church. But no one at the time really worried about the liturgy, right? So liturgical practices were seen as basically, rubrics, just different rites that were performed. And it was more or less assumed, of course, if you added some faulty rubric, it would be because of some bad theology. And so it was more or less assumed that all those errors would be caught before they even got to the area of the liturgy, right? Because it first had to come out as weird theological ideas, and they would catch that. So no one really focused on paying attention, keeping a guard, if you will, over the liturgy. And so that was something of an open door for modernists to kind of start entering in quietly. At first kind of talking about, the history of the liturgy. We're going to study, the primitive liturgies, those sorts of things. But of course, using that little by little as a means of introducing some modernist ideas. Another thing that the liturgy was very helpful for as far as modernism is concerned, I already mentioned this a little bit, speaking of Dom Calzelle, but modernists are all about religious experience, right? I want to feel God, and that's how God is made present to me, is by me feeling his presence. And of course, a very good thing that produces these experiences and these feelings are the liturgical rites. And so that becomes the possibility of being a very active ground for modernism, right? They really understood the old adage, lex orandi, lex credendi, right? So the law of prayer is the law of belief. The way you pray and the way you believe will match each other, right? One will follow the other. If one changes drastically, eventually the other will evolve as well. And so the modernists definitely saw that connection between prayer and belief. And they understood that if they could affect prayer in a very deep way, very profound way, they could also promote the evolution of dogma in their favor, the evolution of belief. right? So essentially, the liturgical movement, in a certain way, almost becomes kind of the ideal Trojan horse for modernism that had been condemned by Pius X to kind of re-enter and spread its influence throughout the church. Mm-hmm. The liturgical movement was very popular, very well known, had influence of a bunch of the clergy, and so this is seen. This could be a good way of kind of re-entering, right? A new ground for spreading these ideas. Another problem with this at the same time, so historically, monasteries are not subject to quite the same scrutiny as the diocesan realm, right? So priests preaching in a monastery, simply because it's just less public. Priest preaching on his own in the monastery doesn't always have the same public effect as a diocesan priest preaching in some big cathedral, right? Or a parish church. That's going to be something that's much more known, what he's preaching, as opposed to a monastery. It can be a little bit more hidden, right? And so in the monasteries, and this is unfortunately particularly in the Dominican order in France, there was one professor of dogma, he's Father Marie Dominique Shinu. So Dominican priest, professor of dogma, and eventually rector at Le Seul Croix, which is a Dominican theological studies, house of studies. And so he is a modernist. He was a modernist. And he begins with, especially teaching dogma as the rector of this theological school. He has a very profound effect on a whole generation of young French Dominicans. And so, sad to say, but many of the French Dominicans at the time ended up becoming modernists, largely due to his influence, and most notably to the more well-known names that you'll probably recognize, Father Yves Congar and Edward Schillebeeckx, both major players in the Second Vatican Council. So they're both formed under this Father Shinu. In any case, this is kind of going on at the time, and a little bit back to liturgical movement. There are many contacts which are formed between the young modernist clergy and the liturgical movement, due largely to Dom Baudouin's liturgical retreats that he was having. So their modernist influence starts to kind of affect the liturgical movement itself. So World War II's contribution to this whole period is basically complete chaos, right? So the hierarchy of the church, the Roman authorities, are distracted. They have a lot of other things to worry about. Hitler's invasion of all of Europe, of Italy, trying to help people be fed, all the different vagaries of wartime, and all the different charitable activities that the church engages itself in. These things all become more the focus of the authorities, which is just kind of normal in that sort of situation. So basically, there's such a period of chaos that the radicals in the church and in the liturgical movement, in a certain way, kind of have a little bit of free reign. They're able to kind of run wild because that oversight that was exercised, especially in the reign of St. Pius X, but even afterwards, is greatly relaxed, right? In the period during the war and in the rebuilding right after the war.
Okay.
So, kind of in general, now I'm going to go back to French-speaking countries, German-speaking countries, try to, follow these two threads, if you will. So in French-speaking countries, in France this time, we come back to Dom Baudouin. right? So we had left him in Bourges, France, giving his little retreats. He himself described them as his, quote, naughty little retreats, because he knew that Rome didn't want him to give them. But he finds this little out-of-the-way spot to start giving them. And since there's lots of chaos, the authorities aren't really paying much attention. He's more or less protected by his bishop, who was kind of liberal, who was definitely liberal. Any case, and so all his retreats start to have a big effect, spreading these ideas throughout the French clergy, mostly in Paris. Also, once again, since old dogs go back to their old tricks, he himself was a bit old to get mixed up in the resistance, but many of his proteges were greatly involved in the French resistance movement at the time, and that actually has the effect of putting them more into contact with the French socialists. So the French Socialist Party, which was kind of on the outskirts of French society, French political society, after Germany invades, they begin to be looked on as patriots, right? Because the socialists are opposed to the National Socialists, the Nazis. And so they're very heavily involved in the resistance movement. And so socialism, Marxism even starts kind of having some influence on the liturgical movement. So the biggest, I guess, occurrence that happened in France during this time, during kind of the 1940s. So this actually is towards the end of the Second World War in January 1945. A number of Dominican and Jesuit fathers, all quite liberal, and some even Marxist, they come together with Dom Baudouin to found what was called the, I'm just going to translate the name into English, the Center of the Pastoral Liturgy, right? So it's a place that actually still exists to this day. It's called the Centre du Pastoral Liturgique in French. But anyway, it's a place that still exists, and it really became kind of the liturgical powerhouse in France at the time. So I actually took this from their modern day website. They talk about their history. So they say that their task was to make all of those who thought that the liturgy is for God and pastoral work is for men, so two separate things, liturgy for God, pastoral work for men, to make them realize that on the contrary, the liturgy is a true pastoral environment, right? So definitely influenced by Dom Baudouin's whole idea of, the pastoral, apostolic aspects of the liturgy. And so they say its method was to have study sessions discussing the liturgy, as well as have annual congresses, was brought together 400 or 500 priests. These congresses and meetings were places to exchange and deepen ideas, which prepared the way for the eventual council. Right? So they can already even see at the time a little bit what they're getting ready for, right? So this house, liturgical house, if you will, publishes a new liturgical review called The House of God, La Maison Dieu in French. And in the very first edition of it, Dom Baudouin wrote an editorial, and he kind of explains, let's say, how the liturgical movement needs to proceed. He's quite an old man at this time, but nonetheless, he's still very much influenced, very much involved in the liturgical movement. So he says we have to kind of, free ourselves from the current rigid discipline to return to the power, the efficacy of the ancient and especially Eastern mystery rites. And he also notices that the Holy See exercises a lot of oversight. And but he says they encourage us to study historical sources. So that's where we go. We're going to go to the historical studies to investigate the origin and evolution of these rites. And then he says, and then we have to spread these ideas to the hierarchy, So he says we have to proceed hierarchically, right? So to quote from this that editorial, we cannot take any initiative in practice other than that is what is at present legitimate, but prepare for the future by fostering a desire and love for all the riches contained in the ancient liturgy in order to condition people's minds. Right? So it's kind of this very subtle way of influencing, and especially influencing the hierarchy, because he knows that's where the changes are going to come from. So just one more quote from a priest, Father Duployer is his name. He was involved with this liturgical pastoral center. He kind of explains a little bit of what they did back in the early days. Some of it's interesting. So he says, we also made contacts with the representatives of various Christian churches, so non-Catholic Christian churches. Dom Baudouin taught us now and always not to disassociate ecumenism from the liturgy. And he goes on, we are an advance guard in the French clergy. We don't speak the same language as the majority of parish priests. And if most of the bishops follow our effort with sympathy, we must not hide from ourselves the fact that this sympathy can very well exist with an almost complete ignorance of the principles which guide us. Between this vanguard and this liturgical pastoral center and the great mass of the French clergy, we must take a tactic of creating gaps. So the gaps we fear will be produced if we do not have recourse to an economical and pedagogical exposition of the truth discovered by us. We must know how to keep silence and to wait, right?
Wow.
So basically, we have to be prudent, recognizing we are the rest of the clergy is not at all on par with us. And even though the bishops may support us, they don't really understand what motivates us. So this Father Duployer is actually not one of the most radical ones. But it's interesting when he talks about that. So he's writing about this at the time. All right, so we're going to move over, still in the section of World War II, so 1940s, World War II and its aftermath. We'll look at Germany, so German-speaking countries. So the German liturgical movement we already saw with Pius Parsch was already getting pretty radical. You had the Mass in German, and also actually during the time, liturgical movement in Germany, again, very much in contact with the youth, was also a little bit influenced by some of the spirit of the Hitler Youth, with kind of the arrogance and the just kind of this revolutionary spirit. We want to change. And that being the case, the liturgical movement in Germany becomes radical very quickly. And so we're still in 1939. Some of the German bishops recognize this and they react. So there's a kind of a conservative counter-reaction to this. And so the German bishops gathered at Fulda in 1939 to discuss putting an end to all these liturgical excesses. And some of the German bishops who are more liberal, end up kind of taking over this discussion, and they push for, which is eventually decided by all the bishops, they push for the formation of a committee to kind of take charge of liturgical questions for the bishops, right? The bishops had a lot of other things to worry about. Hitler was just about to start the war at the time. Yeah. So they form this committee, and they say, well, we're going to put the people who really know liturgy, involved in this committee, and they would be the ones who kind of, oversee and make sure there's no excesses. And the ones they put inside, in fact, were already the clergy who were already pretty progressive, as it were, such as Cordini, we already mentioned him, and Jungmann, who we'll come into later. Okay. And so that kind of takes control of the whole situation. And now, all of a sudden, those who are supposed to be keeping an eye, making sure things didn't get too radical, are themselves the radicals. Right? Nonetheless, this doesn't stop one German bishop, Archbishop Grober, who was very conservative. He wrote a letter that he addressed to all the German bishops, expressing his concerns about the liturgical movement as it existed in Germany at the time. And in that letter, we find actually many of the characteristics of the new Mass, which he is complaining about to his fellow bishops. So archaeologism, excessive emphasis on the common priesthood of the faithful, insistence on the meal aspect of the Mass, translating all the prayers of the Mass into German, etc. Mm-hmm. So his letter, unfortunately, didn't have a lot of effect with the German bishops. But one thing it does do is it brings the attention of the Holy See. So Pius XII received this letter, and he was a good pope, and he begins to be, it kind of raises the red flag for him, if you will. And he would send an investigative body to go and see what's going on. The investigators were pretty much turned aside by the liberal bishops who just basically told him, well, Archbishop Grober is overreacting, so it's not actually that bad. And so the investigation is more or less stalled. But Archbishop Grober's letter does have the good effect of prompting the publication of two encyclicals, Mystici Corporis in 1943 and especially Mediator Dei in 1947, where Pius XII really lays down the traditional principles in regard to the liturgy. Unfortunately, Mediator Dei was even though it was very good, it didn't take any real concrete measures to address the practical problems. And Pius XII, he just kind of goes to the principles, which is good, but he not hitting the practical problem, not making a practical way to address this, concrete measures. Then basically his reprimand ends up being mostly ignored, unfortunately.
Yeah. So he's basically saying, hey, this is what we need to do. And he's assuming that everyone who's going to be reading it, especially those in Germany who are leading this charge, are going to read it and go, whoops, corrected. But they're going to go, right. Oh, he didn't mention me, not talking about me, right? It's like, right. Or it's almost like little kids.
Yeah. And some of the more radical proponents even use it because he praises the liturgical movement. They even use it as kind of a means of promoting their changes because the Pope wants liturgical renewal. So this is what we have to do. We have to keep going with this, right? Ignoring the fact that he's trying to actually rein right in while, promoting liturgical renewal. He's not the excesses that they're going to.
Yeah.
So anyway, that finishes off World War II period. It's been a while. Perhaps it's better if we make this 2 podcasts.
Yeah, I think so. And that's a good stopping point because then we'll be able to look at, what happened from the 1950s afterwards. And things are going to kind of accelerate, right?
Right. Yeah. So 1950s is where you really see everything becomes much more vocal. The modernists become much more vocal and the changes already start to occur.
Okay.
Yeah. So
great. Father, looking forward to hearing about that next week. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Andrew.